This is Now What? Life After Redundancy. When your job disappears, but you don't. Hello. I'm Stevie, and you're joining me on my journey through and hopefully past redundancy, where I'm regularly asking myself the question, now what? And this show exists for anyone who's found their career in that strange in-between bit. You're capable, you've got a CV, you know what you're doing, and yet somehow your brain has a daily ritual where it audits every professional decision you've ever made since 2009. Each episode is part practical, part perspective, and part reminder that you're not in this alone. Now, redundancy does a lot of things to you, and most of them, frankly, are quite unwelcome. But one of the genuinely unexpected upsides, and I don't think there are that many, but I'm holding on to this one, is the people you get to speak with. Conversations you would never have had if you'd stayed put. Perspectives you wouldn't have gone looking for if nothing had changed. Now, before redundancy, my exposure to stories of people navigating major reinvention was, let's say, limited. I'd watched a lot of Jerry Springer, which, depending on your age, is either a cultural reference or a name you're going to have to Google. Actually, is Jerry Springer still a thing? The point is, this journey has introduced me to people I'd have never crossed paths with otherwise. And today's guest is a very good example of that. In a moment, I'm going to be speaking with Geoff Curtis, author of Embracing Your Own Purgatory. And the book is an honest exploration of the uncomfortable spaces between identities that most of us spend enormous energy trying to escape. It's a book about transition, about what happens when a version of yourself built around your career suddenly doesn't fit anymore, and about why the answer might not be to sprint out of that feeling as quickly as possible. But before we get into that, a few quick things. If you find this show useful at any point, the best thing you can do is follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. It truly helps more people find it, and it costs you nothing except the few seconds it takes to tap a button. And if you have a few extra seconds, you could leave a review. The reviews go a long way, even a teeny tiny one. You don't have to write an essay. One sentence is fine, unless you want to write an essay, in which case, go for it. I'm going to read every word. And if you're looking for practical support beyond the podcast, community resources, tools, head over to theinvisibleq.co.uk. It's built specifically for people navigating redundancy, and it's not a recruitment site dressed up in empathy. It's the real thing. And finally, if you would like to get in touch with the show, share your story, or suggest something you'd like covered in a future episode, head to thenowwhat.co.uk and use the contact page. I would genuinely love to hear from you. Right, enough of all that. Let's get to it. So my guest today is Geoff Curtis, the author of Embracing Your Own Purgatory. And that is an honest exploration of the uncomfortable spaces between identities that we spend most of our energy trying to escape. Geoff spent nearly 30 years as a communications executive, working at C-suite level across agency and corporate settings, both in the United States and internationally. He's a mentor, a coach to young professionals and university students, and a philanthropist with specific commitment to education access and equity. His book's available on Amazon. I'm going to put a link in the description, but you can just search Embracing Your Own Purgatory and you'll find it. You can also connect with Geoff directly on LinkedIn. The link is going to be in the description. Right then, over to Geoff. Geoff, thank you so much for joining me today. It's fantastic to meet you. Just before we kind of get into your book, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you did before your book happened?
Yes, thanks for having me, Steve. I appreciate it. My name is Geoff Curtis, and I spent nearly 30 years in the healthcare communications industry, in the last 9 as Executive Vice President and Chief Communications Officer at a biotech company. And I know we'll probably get into discussing this further, but exited post-acquisition and have been kind of dabbling in writing a book and finding my way since. And I know that that's what we're going to get into. So excited to talk about it.
Brilliant stuff. And your book is called Embracing Your Own Purgatory. The one thing that struck me was the title, Embracing Your Own Purgatory. That word purgatory is a very specific word to choose. It'd be good to understand where that came from and when it arrived.
Well, it's a twofold story, and it's doubly interesting because I'm not really a religious person, so the word doesn't necessarily fit kind of my background. But I did choose that word specifically to kind of mean in between, and I know those familiar with the theology piece of it, it is kind of that in between space, not heaven, not hell, and just the passage and purification into the next life. But I chose it because I felt it fit my situation, Steve, better than transition or reinvention, because I don't think I'm quite there yet. And I wanted it to feel okay for people to, one, see the title, but as they're reading the book, know that it's okay to be in that in-between space versus already transitioned, already reinvented. And I often find that a lot of the self-help books that have been written talk about those two things and are often inaccessible for people who are still kind of going through it and don't necessarily need to hear the shiny post story of, oh, I've done all of these things. I want to potentially hear from someone who's still going through it. And I'll just tell one quick story. I was talking to the publisher and we were kind of batting back and forth and having a conversation about how the book would be positioned, because it started out as a book about being a communications person who couldn't communicate his own transition, and how I'd helped executives throughout my entire career kind of do those things, and I couldn't do it myself. And I think I used at one point during the discussion with the publisher the word purgatory and how we need to embrace discomfort and all of that. And he immediately stopped and said, that's how you're going to market the book, using a word like purgatory.
It definitely resonates because I'm sure a lot of folk listening as well kind of recognize that feeling as part of their redundancy journeys. In your book, I believe you talk about careers becoming enmeshed with an individual's identity. And for those listening who haven't had that moment of recognition yet, what does that type of thing actually look like?
Well, first I'll start with just the kind of the psychological term that I use because it's been well researched. And just for your listeners, it's enmeshment is really when that boundary between career and yourself blurs considerably, and there's no separation between the two. So it's a really deep and kind of pithy term, I think, that when you start thinking about it. For me, it feels comfortable. It felt so comfortable, and frankly, I still have flashes back where it really feels comfortable, where that identity is something you built over time. It's the scaffolding that kind of holds you together, and it feels really safe. And so people who are going through a redundancy or in the middle of it, or just starting to realize that their career may be their identity, it's easier to kind of see and feel when you have a word that kind of defines it, and particularly that blurred line between who you really are and your work. If that is starting to meld and mesh more, then I think it's time to take a hard look. But it can be very, very comfortable, really comfortable.
And do you feel there's a particular type of person who's more at risk of tying their whole selves to a professional title, or is it something more universal than that?
I think it's probably endemic in high achievers, people who have just automatically, over the course of their career, built their self-worth or their image, expertise just on their title. And I think for the high achiever, why it's so risky is that we just don't do well with holding patterns. We don't do well with that emptiness and that space and that uncomfortable place. And so I think those people who have been driving and achieving are at considerable risk for this. I went back and I took a personality test because I interviewed somebody else in the book who was an Enneagram. Enneagram is a personality test that some of your listeners may be familiar with. But I'm a type 1, and somebody else who I interviewed was a type 4. And that type 1 is just, the whole identity is built around doing things right. And with an inner critic always over your shoulder saying, you should be further along, you should be further along. And again, that drives that achievement, that drives that high energy to just be better. And I think when you start to feel that inside yourself, it becomes a significant risk to be enmeshed in a career eventually, or frankly, over time.
There was mention around kind of your own experience and you realizing that you had an obsession with productivity and that was doing damage rather than driving progress. The part I'd like to understand is, when did you realize that that was taking effect?
Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but I realized it through the writing, Steve. And I think that the thing that stands out the most is when my father passed away in 2007. And just for a little context, we thought he had a stroke. He entered the hospital at the end of February in 2007 and never left, and passed away in March of 2007. So he was only in the hospital for a month. And in looking back on that time, and I didn't know when I was kind of in it, but I was trying to fix everything. I was in, as I mentioned, in the healthcare communication space. He had a healthcare related issue. So I was trying to track down as many contacts as I could, help with doctors, do all of those things. And I spent more time doing that because that felt comfortable to me than dealing with the emotion of my father sitting in the intensive care unit. And that was a real kind of shock to my system in looking back, because I didn't know that I was really in it then until I really looked back and said, I spent a month trying to fix him because that's what felt comfortable to me, and kind of avoided all of that emotion and sitting with my father and having conversation with him. And one of our last meaningful conversations, as I write about in the book, was about passwords, about bank passwords, and getting all of that detail from, because it was a task. It was a task for me to complete. And that was one of those things that stood out that made me really start to look at, okay, what were the patterns throughout my entire life and career that led to all that avoidance, that led to that running, that led to just, why was I so comfortable doing that versus sitting in a room with my father every day? I don't know if I still have the answer, but to your question, that's kind of when I really started to see that it had been damaging over time, and trying really hard as I move forward not to replicate scenarios like that.
That's a really powerful answer, and thank you for sharing that. As someone who writes lists to keep myself sane,
right,
I recognize that.
Right, and again, I think what's interesting, Steve, too, is it's even that little story that when I hear feedback about the book, regardless of age, because I do think the book is age agnostic, one of the stories fed back to me was almost the exact same thing. A younger former colleague of mine who was sitting in a hospital room with her boyfriend, and she was on email at 11 p.m. at night while he was sitting there, because there was that comfort of the work and the avoidance of sitting what's right next to you. And so it's something that I hope at least teaches people to slow down a bit and just take a beat when confronted with situations particularly like that, or even deeper.
When it comes to transitions, you draw a distinction between chosen and imposed transitions. And I think most folk listening to this podcast didn't necessarily choose the redundancy journey. It was generally done to them on a random afternoon with very little notice. Why does that loss of control change things so fundamentally?
I don't know that it necessarily changed things fundamentally, but there is a distinction. So with the chosen, I think you still have your agency intact. And I think that's an important thing for people, is I made the choice, I have the control, I'm able to make the next decision. I feel good about this. You have your agency intact. And I think when it's out of your control, there's nothing that you can outwork or out strategize. And I think that is, again, back to the high achiever thing, that is a big deal for high achievers, is that with any issue, you always think you can outwork, out strategize, we can move on from the problem, because we want to maintain that agency. And when that agency is stripped away from us a little bit, so are the metrics, so are a lot of different things. You lose a role and you lose kind of the scoreboard all at once. And it's hard to kind of understand how to get that back since it was so tied together.
That makes sense. And I think it kind of leads on to another question, which was the thing that I reflect on very, very frequently is that I think we all have stories that we tell ourselves to maintain that control. And I know that I've spent a solid 3 weeks convincing myself I was being strategic when I was generally just refreshing multiple job boards in different orders. But do you hear kind of common stories around the types of stories folk tell themselves, and why do they stick with them so much?
Well, first, I think as I explained on what the original title of the book was was going to be, how I could communicate my own transition. I think the stories I was telling myself and the stories I always told myself was, it created some interesting irony, right? Because it made me good at my job, but it also became a very easy mechanism for me to avoid my own truth. And so as I detail in the book, I said out loud and wrote on LinkedIn at one point that I was taking a pause, and I was really enjoying the pause that I was taking, doing all of these things. And I think that's one. I think that's a big substitute, is people want to feel good or want to get that external validation that what they're doing, that they have their agency. They've made the choice to take this pause. People who say that they're exploring options. I'm consulting. I didn't know how to introduce myself. I didn't know what to tell people, all because it was through the lens of that external validation and what people thought I should be doing. Oh, Geoff's been in this for 30 years, so he should go and consult. And that's basically what I did. And it was a lot of that external pressure and need for validation that kind of drove me to the consulting thing. And what's funny is that I had a conversation maybe 2 weeks ago, and somebody asked me, oh, so what are you doing post your job and what's going on and and I said, yeah, I'm consulting a little bit. And I walked away and I said, I don't even know why the hell I said that. Why did I say that? I'm not doing that right now. And it's just because you want to tell this story that says I'm in control. I'm in control and I'm okay. And I think part of hopefully what the book does is just say, it's okay not to be okay right now. And it's okay to take a little bit of that time and not have to tell a story. Tell people you're good with the break that you're taking.
That resonates so much. I randomly had a kind of a friend of a friend. We were all hanging out together the other week, and it was that moment where it was like, so what do you do? And I was just like, I really don't want to go into this right now. So I'm just like, oh, this and that, and then move the conversation on.
Well, and I think as too, Steve, a lot of that is driven from who you're speaking with as well. And I'll tell you one additional story. This past weekend, I ran into a few members of the media here in the US who I used to work with very closely throughout my career. And we were at a social gathering, and I probably hadn't seen either of them in maybe a decade, but we knew each other very well. And I have to say that they weren't necessarily hounding me about what I was doing and what I was going to do in the next year. It was, oh, here you wrote a book. Shouldn't you be writing books and all of this thing? And I said, "Ooh, this is weird." Because it wasn't the context that I knew them, but it felt really good because there was no external pressure for me to say, "Hey, I'm still in the game," or "I'm doing this," or "I'm working with this client." No, they just wanted to catch up with me as a person because they hadn't seen me in a while. And that feels really good. And so back to the whole storytelling thing, you eventually get used to and grow out of kind of that knee-jerk story reaction where you don't have to say that, because a lot of it is just dependent on the external back and forth between who's asking and who you're interacting with. And it feels good when you don't have that pressure to go down that former road of the road of your former identity.
So redundancy tends to carry a very specific sting that other career transition approaches don't necessarily. And in my experience, there's kind of a rejection baked into it, even when that redundancy decision has been entirely structural. How do you feel that people should process something that feels personal but really officially isn't?
Yeah, again, I don't know that the processing is any different. I think it's, as we've been talking about, it's kind of letting the discomfort have a little bit of air, whether it's redundancy, whether it's just a straight layoff, whatever it is, or whether it's just it's loss. I mean, talking about my father, even if it's just loss, I think it's kind of letting that discomfort speak for a little bit, give it a little air instead of drowning with activity, which is what we usually do, and it's often meaningless and it's not productive. And so I think it's, even for a limited amount of time, just being okay in that uncomfortable space, because it's one of those things where you can't really logic your way out of it. And I think that's again, another knee-jerk reaction, trying to logic your way out of it. And it gets harder and harder to do. And I just know that that discomfort can tell us something. And so just let it speak for a little bit to see if it's giving us any insight that we may not have had before while we were in whatever we were in.
One of the things I reflected on is that there seems to be quite a cultural script, and I assume this is the same for the US as it is for the UK, but there seems to be this script for redundancy that is essentially along the lines of, you feel a bit rubbish for a bit, you dust yourself off, you get back out there. Do you see there being anything wrong with that approach?
Well, I mean, now, I didn't before, and now I do, and it's not anything that's egregiously wrong. It's just that I think we do a disservice to ourselves if we kind of maintain that script throughout our entire lives and career. And the disservice is that we're not really taking the time to understand who we are and who you are when you're not doing what you just did, or when you're not doing what you're doing now. And it also kind of mistakes speed for strength and process. I think we're always so quick to say we have to go do that next thing because we're uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean we're making progress. And I think part of that, again, as I said before, it's really a disservice to ourselves. And that's a learning that I've had, Steve, over time. Not happening overnight, and it's been happening for the last 2.5 years. And it's how do you kind of avoid that getting back out there, or even going to the next thing that may not be the previous thing, without kind of understanding who you are and how you're going to operate when something may happen again. And so I think it's just that depth of work that needs to be done on ourselves before we move on to the next thing. Again, as I was talking about before, people love to see the nice, tidy redemption, the triumphant pivot, or whatever it is in externally, because I think that's our audience. But it's okay not to have that. And those are messy. Those are really messy. And people always promote the results versus the process. And I know you know that, but you see the end result. And that's what gives us so much pressure. People don't talk about the 2 years that led them to that result.
I've again, I'll just slight aside, but I've spoken on this podcast previously around the comparison traps that is so easy to fall into. And it's this whole thing of like, you either know the person and you've followed the story, and then it's that piece of they're doing really, really well, why aren't I there as well? Or it's someone you don't really know and you just see their headline of, I've just succeeded, I'm delighted to announce that I've got this thing, but you haven't seen the journey that they've been on and kind of the ups and downs and that emotional roller coaster. And it's a difficult one to balance in your mind around kind of how you feel about it when you're kind of witnessing it externally.
It's funny you bring that up. I always tell, I speak to a lot of college students and entry-level professionals. And of course, I give them advice that I don't take myself, which is, again, another irony. And what you just said, though, is I always tell those younger people to run their own race, because they think they're racing against people who don't know. Those people don't know that you're racing. And so it's kind of getting in that mindset of you just have to stay on track. And it's hard to get out of that mindset. And the last thing I'll say, too, is I didn't write this book to be a bestseller. And that was kind of my baseline. It's not going to be I don't need it to be a bestseller. I just want it to increase conversation and give people permission to have this type of conversation. And sure enough, spoke with a marketing person and agreed to do a Amazon bestseller campaign. And I didn't get it. And I was angry for probably 2 days because I had three other people who are in my network who wrote books around the same time, launched around the same time, totally different books, Steve. And what am I doing? I'm comparing myself against their results and what I'm seeing on LinkedIn and, all of those things that you just said. And it's just hard to get out of that competitive mindset because you've been in it for so long.
Absolutely.
So you draw a distinction between productive waiting and avoidance. And I kind of feel that line is really easy to blur when you're kind of in the thick of it. It'd be good to kind of hear how you feel that someone can tell the difference between those two.
Yeah, I think it's simple. It's, for me, the honest test is, what is the activity for? Like, what are you doing what you're doing for? And I talk a lot about how I immediately was trying to keep my calendar filled, networking, coffees, advising. They were all legitimate things that I felt that I needed to do, but they were also all avoidance. And so I couldn't sit down and understand, okay, is this advancing something? Is this advancing the work that I need to do on myself? No, it's actually really a tie to the past thing that I was doing, or the past identity that I had. And so I think the productive waiting piece of it allows people to tolerate the discomfort, where the avoidance exists to specifically keep the discomfort away. And so I think that's kind of the distinction that people should be looking for. And it's just watching the voids, and are you filling that space because you feel you need to fill the space maybe with meaningless substitutes that really don't advance what you want to do or where you're going. So it's, how do you start to understand that signal that feels really comfortable in doing what I'm doing? And I mean, I still fall into the trap these days, but it's kind of raising your awareness, but also just really being, taking a hard line on what the activity is for and what is it advancing.
I kind of feel very, very seen in that. So that pressure to bounce back quickly from a redundancy or a transition journey, where does that pressure come from, in your opinion, and whose interest does it actually serve?
Well, I think we've been talking about it quite a bit. I think that it comes from just the external culture that kind of celebrates the comeback story, or that tidy final finished product of redemption or transition. And it almost treats the pause or the work in between as failure. And I think that's primarily where it comes from. It often, I mean, for me, I was serving an audience that I thought I needed to serve, an external audience that I needed to serve even early on post my transition, just because it was comfortable. And when that facade, as I talk about in the book, starts to fall away, it gets a little bit chilly. And you realize that the external audience that you were serving may not care as much as you think. You don't really have to work as hard to make them happy, and why not show them the work that needs to be done? And I think what's interesting is that people are really responding to me from that space just because they feel that they have permission to show that kind of work and the process that's getting people to a certain spot. And what's been fascinating to me, I've been hearing a lot of feedback from men, and there's a common refrain, Steve, that they either DM via LinkedIn or email that, and some of these people who I've known for 15 years say, I don't know if you knew this about me, but, and then there's 4 or 5 paragraphs on a lot of different things. And so that right there tells me that, okay, they're comfortable at least showing some of the work that got them to where they are.
Oh, that's really powerful. And I think kind of just building from that, and you've kind of touched on parts of this already, but with regards to kind of high achievers, so I'm thinking specifically the kind of folk who've always been able to outwork a problem, as you said before. It appears that those individuals kind of hit a wall when they're on this journey. What do you see is really happening when their tried and tested approaches stop working?
Well, I think our tools, the always work harder, outwork the problem, I can solve anything, they stop working. I mean, it's the one function that doesn't if you're in a holding pattern, or if you're sitting in purgatory, it's the one thing that you can't really outwork because there's no defined outcome. You don't know what the outcome may be. And I think that's a struggle. For me, it was a real reckoning because it was one thing that I was outrunning my entire career. I wasn't working to, this time it's not solving for any output or sort of solving for any result. It's solving for identity. I think that's just, I can't do that with the skill that I had before that made me good at my job. And that, I think, is just the really big mental struggle that people have, because the thing that they're used to and the approach that they're used to, it just doesn't translate to the problem that needs to be solved. And I think that is where people get backed up quite a bit.
For those folk who've genuinely built their sense of purpose through their career, and I totally put myself in that category, and it wasn't ego, it was just real. What do you see as finding meaning outside of work actually require of them?
Well, I think it's not that every task has to deliver purpose. And I think that's the first thing. And it's that the discomfort and what we've been talking about isn't necessarily a failure. It's actually kind of recalibrating your mind a little bit to find, okay, what is that new purpose? And that is a difficult journey after a major transition. It's not easy. And I think once you let kind of that old identity or just your new identity or however you're thinking about yourself be a little bit more provisional, and you have that space to try out new versions of yourself, I think that can help you down the path that gets you out of the mindset that everything I have to do today has to have purpose. And I think that's something we got in a loop about, or can get in a loop about, with career, because I think we have to, there's a beginning and end, and this is the purpose of a task. And we all fell into it, but I just don't think that that every task every day has to have purpose. So that's, to me, the biggest thing. I mean, right now, I'm trying to find different ways to express purpose that I probably had all along that was really separate from my job. My wife and I are big from a philanthropic standpoint into education, access, and equity, and we're doing something on the nonprofit side that is helping that. So there's purpose there in a different venue, but where I can still kind of equate with my past identity in the communication space. But there's different, and each thing every day that we're doing related to that doesn't have purpose. It doesn't, but the end goal does. So it's just kind of that reframe and how you view each task, and either whether it has purpose or it doesn't have purpose, but you don't have to hold yourself to that with every specific task.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I guess kind of from that response and kind of some of the points you made earlier, it definitely sounds that there's a piece about moving from external validation to that internal fulfillment and finding that internal purpose. And that sounds fantastic in theory, and it also sounds quite difficult in practice.
Yeah.
So thinking about some of the practical things, what does that transition require of someone?
So I think it requires just one, honesty with yourself on kind of how deeply the patterns that you had, how deep they are, how deeply they run. I'm talking a lot about now with people about just that constant replication without reflection. And again, I think it's you do things again and again and again. That's a definition of it with the same result as a definition of insanity. So that's kind of close to the replication without reflection. But I think you have to get to understanding, okay, I've replicated the same 5 things over the last 10 years, and I've never reflected on what went right, what went wrong, was it the right thing? And so I think that's where the honesty comes in looking at your patterns. I think it's turning kind of that outward wisdom that we talked about inward, about giving the advice that you give others and not paying attention to it yourself. It's, I said that I've advised companies on certain things and incapable of following that same advice. So I think you have to really be attentive to kind of what wisdom you're putting out there, and is that applicable to your specific situation. And then lastly, it's the metrics. The metrics are going to change. From the last job I had, the last job you had, Steve, the metrics are different now, and you have to give up those metrics. And that's why I reacted so adversely to the Amazon bestseller thing, because I was operating under old metrics and I couldn't get those away. And so it's just understanding that the new metrics may be more achievable, may be easier, and that's okay. And that's good enough. It really is, because you're setting down you're laying down a new path and setting a new course it's just going to be defined differently.
You just made me think of there's a saying that I always keep coming back to, one that always kind of keeps rolling around in my head, is never let perfect stand in the way of good. And it's
Yeah.
that principle of trying to strive for that perfection every single time could actually prevent you doing something good in the meantime.
Well, to the theme too about avoidance, perfection is the greatest form of avoidance. It really is, particularly for higher achievers. It really is, because we map these perfect scenarios that we know we're never going to achieve, but it allows us to keep going and going and going and going and avoiding things that we may need to address. And it's a crazy cycle. And when I started kind of looking at that type of experience as I was writing the book, it was fascinating. I said, oh, this is why this makes avoidance so easy, because I know I'm never going to achieve perfection, but I can still try.
Makes sense. And so thinking about the book, if someone picked it up mid-redundancy, they've got applications going out, their email is really quiet, and it's, they're doing their best method acting of someone who's entirely fine. What's the one thing you'd want them to take from it that a job search guide wouldn't give them?
The biggest thing is that the book is permission, not a plan. And I know a lot of people are looking for a 5-step plan to get that next job. And all I'm asking is that just give yourself permission to sit with a little bit of discomfort for not even an extended period of time, however long that time, just so that you can process. You can really process, you can really investigate yourself. And again, the book ends with still in purgatory. I still consider myself in purgatory, and that's the kind of the whole point. It's not a flaw. It's taking that time to understand who you are. So it's really about that permission piece. Give yourself permission to just sit with it. And it's not about how do I land that next role fast. It's, which I know people need to do in a lot of cases, and which is why I don't necessarily put a time frame on it. But it's also understanding who you are when you're not doing that work. And I think that is even if that's for a limited amount of time, asking yourself that question, that's going to inform the next thing. And it frankly may inform your search. You may start looking at different things. You may be able to take your skill set, and if you've even done a little bit of work in asking yourself some of these questions, or really taking that, looking internally and retrospectively at your career, you may make a different decision. And so it's just give yourself a little bit of permission to take that space.
So probably a difficult question to ask you is, the whole framework around embracing your own purgatory, it appears to be a suggestion around sitting with or embracing that discomfort rather than running away from it. And I can imagine that's a difficult thing to sell to someone whose mortgage payment is due. Is that what you're asking of people, or is there a different kind of tone to it that we want to call out?
Yeah, I think there's a slightly different tone. And again, it's not a time-based thing. And so all I'm saying is that whatever amount of time you have, and I obviously would not tell anybody not to pay their bills or not to pay their mortgage, but even if it's just a 2 to 3 days to sit with yourself and ask questions, even if you've already found your new job, or if you're consulting, or if you're doing some work on the side, can you take some time during the day just to ask yourself some of these things and start investigating some of your patterns? I didn't specifically set time on purpose because I just want people to start asking themselves these things. I have a little bit of flexibility, so I can take more time to do that, but that wasn't the intent. And also too, it's the ask for people reading is a little bit narrower as well. I mean, I don't want people to think that busyness is the only thing. It's, again, avoiding kind of what's happening internally and underneath, that you can still explore the emotion without just filling things just to be busy. Again, we always think that we need to be busy, and we don't. And so whatever time people can devote to that, again, to give themselves that permission to just explore a little bit, that's all I'm asking. And I'm hopeful that people can at least see that and take that a little bit of time, and that's valuable for them to do that.
Brilliant. So, Geoff, if we've piqued someone's interest, where can they go to find out more?
Embracing Your Own Purgatory is available where books are sold. So on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, a lot of bookstores across the world online. And I am doing a lot of different podcasts, broadcast media. And so I look for my stuff on LinkedIn at Geoff Curtis. But yeah, it's I hope people enjoy the read. And frankly, I hope it continues to create a lot more conversation.
Good stuff. And one final thing before I let you go, and it's a question I tend to ask most folk that I interview. In your career experience and thinking about interview experiences, do you have a least favorite interview question, and why is it?
Well, because it's recent, my least favorite these days is, so what's next? What's next for you? Again, because I think it gets back to that testing that, okay, I have to have this packaged great answer for people, and that I don't have that yet. And I'm learning to be okay with that. And I'm learning to say, I don't know. I'm trying to find my path. I mean, I think what's interesting too, Steve, is that I've struggled so much at just the year or year and a half post my exit and how to even introduce myself. And we talked about this earlier, but I think that's kind of gets to the what's next for you thing, because again, you think you have to appease somebody with a title or something that's aligned with what you used to do. And so it's always a tough one, because people are often shocked when I say, I don't know. I'm finding my way. I'm finding my way, and I'm going to continue to work on finding my way.
Brilliant. Geoff, thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully speak to you again.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Hi there, I'm Nick, and when you're not listening to the weekly wisdom from Stevie and in breaking down the strange things happening in your head while navigating redundancy, please check out my fortnightly podcast, Starting Over. Every other week, we explore the stories of incredible individuals through 10 key questions. We dive into the challenges of a career setback or break, personal growth in this time and lessons learned along the way, practical tips to help others facing similar situations, and ultimately a chance to showcase the person behind the CV. Join me as we listen to these journeys and remember collectively that career setbacks and breaks are not the end, but the start of your next chapter. Find Starting Over on wherever you get your podcasts from. But for now, back to Stevie, and take care.
So that was Geoff Curtis. I found that a genuinely fantastic conversation. And if you've just listened to it and felt a specific kind of recognition, that, that slightly uncomfortable feeling of being seen by someone you've never met, that's probably his book doing its job before you've even read it. The thing I kept coming back to from everything Geoff said is the idea of sitting with discomfort rather than sprinting away from it. And I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on that, because I think it's probably the bit that's easiest to nod along to and hardest to actually do. And I know that I've experienced it myself. I don't doubt I will experience it again. But there's a particular phase in the job search that I know I wasn't ready for. And it's not the rejections, oddly enough. Rejections are rubbish, but at least they are something. No, in my mind, the one that gets you is just when it goes weirdly quiet. You've had conversations, threads are moving, things felt like they were building, and then nothing. Your inbox ends up like a waiting room where everyone has been called except you. And the completely rational, completely understandable response to that silence is to fill it. More applications, more activity, more doing, because doing feels like progress even when it isn't. And I know that I did that. I put in high volumes of applications, kept the engine running, told myself that effort and effect were the same thing, and they're not. And eventually, and it wasn't gradually, it was a deliberate decision, I stopped. I recognized that I was truly beating myself up for not making progress despite the volume of work that was going into it, and that the volume wasn't actually the variable that mattered. So I started to limit how many applications I sent per day. I shifted some of that energy into keeping my skill set sharp and let the quiet be quiet for a bit. And that is so much easier to describe than do, I'll be honest. But I kept thinking about how best to describe this, and I came up with a metaphor because I truly find it easy to sit with uncomfortable ideas if there's a slightly ridiculous image attached to it. But imagine you've ordered something online and it arrives. The box is bigger than expected, the assembly instructions are in 4 languages and none of them seem to be in the right order. And when you finish, there are 3 screws left over at the end that the manual doesn't mention. Now, you've got 2 options. You can spend the next period of time frantically Googling whether those screws matter, convincing yourself the whole thing is structurally compromised and dismantling it to start all over again. Or you could put it in a corner, make a cup of coffee, and accept that sometimes things hold together fine even when they don't look finished. Now, redundancy is the flat pack, the leftover screws are the unanswered questions, and the coffee is, well, the coffee is the coffee. Some metaphors just don't need extending. The point is, the urge to immediately fix the uncertainty is understandable, but it's not always the right move. Sometimes the thing that you're building needs time before it's ready to hold weight. So there have been 3 things that I found actually help me when I'm trying to sit with discomfort rather than run away from it. And the first one, and I know I've mentioned this before, but it's to name what you're actually feeling and not what you're doing. Because there's a difference between I'm applying for jobs and I'm applying for jobs because the alternative is admitting that I don't know what I want yet. Because the second one is more useful. It isn't more comfortable, but it's definitely more useful. And when you know what's driving your behaviors, you can decide whether they're actually serving you. Now, the second one is setting a time boundary on the uncertainty. And I have to stress, it's not a deadline to have everything solved, because that's pressure in fancy dress. A boundary is something that says, for the next 2 weeks, I'm not going to try and resolve the big question. I'm going to do some practical things and keep moving and give the other stuff some room to settle down. So to Geoff's book, it's Purgatory with a defined review date, and it's something that's more manageable than Purgatory with no horizon at all. And the third thing is just resisting the urge to make the discomfort mean something that it doesn't. So feeling lost is not evidence that you're failing. Feeling uncertain isn't evidence the wrong decision was made. It's just you're going through transition, and transitions are uncomfortable by design. But there are many, many people in the world who will highlight the fact that periods of growth come from periods of discomfort. And this is likely to be one of those times. So what's the takeaway? In my mind, the key takeaway is that the in-between bit isn't a problem to be solved as quickly as possible. It's a space that, if you can resist the urge to run through it, tends to tell you things about yourself that the busy, productive, title-holding version of you just didn't have time to hear. And that's not a comfortable message, but Geoff makes a compelling case for why it's a necessary one. Geoff's book, Embracing Your Own Purgatory, is available on Amazon. Like I say, link is in the episode description, or you can search for it on Amazon directly. You can connect with Geoff on LinkedIn. Link is also in the description. And if today's episode landed, if something Geoff said is still rattling around in your head, here's what I'd ask. Follow or subscribe to the show if you haven't already. And if you're on a podcast platform that lets you do so, leave a review. If you need it, head to theinvisibleq.co.uk for practical support, community and resources built specifically for people navigating redundancy. And if you would like to share your story, get in touch or just suggest something for a future episode, the nowwhat.co.uk contact page, and I genuinely mean this, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening today, and as always, if you're asking yourself now what, you're in the right place. Before you go, if any of this has been useful, please do me a favour and follow the show wherever you're listening. And if you've got 60 seconds and an opinion, leave a review. It helps other people find the show, and it also stops me wondering if I'm turning into some sort of audio hermit. And if you want more than just my voice turning up in your ears once a week, head to theinvisibleq.com. It's a support platform for people navigating redundancy, built by people who've actually been through it and remember how strange and exhausting the whole thing is. But for now, thank you for listening. Until next time.